Healing is such a central part of the Pentecostal imaginary. Many Pentecostal congregations or churches have altar calls for two things at the end of the service. One is for salvation, and two is for healing. And so the assumption is that God will show up, because God always saves and God always heals. I actually have a little bit different sense of that, in part because I've got a brother with Down syndrome. So I've thought a lot over the years about healing in relationship to disability. One of the things in which I've been, in my own journey, have been invited to think about with regard to healing is how can we, while not minimizing these practices in relationship to healing, how can we understand healing in a lot of other ways besides in the usual way that Pentecostals understand it, which has to do with usually bodily forms of healing. When my brother was born, my parents, again, this was almost 40 years ago, prayed for his healing. The assumption was that when God heals Mark, all of these features, these symptoms would be removed. That's what healing means, right? Well, 40 years later now, if you ask my mom to talk about Mark, and she'll give you testimonies about Mark, right? But these testimonies about Mark include his healing, but not in any ways. Well, I mean, he was healed certainly of his leukemia, his pneumonia. He had 2 murmurs in his heart. God healed those, not miraculously, but by using surgeons that closed those murmurs up. That's why he's still living 40 years later. So my mom will give you testimonies of Mark's healing, but his healing now is understood much more broadly. His healing is understood to include how God has used him in our lives, in our families, how God has used his life to bear witness to God's glory to others around him. How do we continue to pray for healing, but be more sensitive to the different ways in which people with disabilities live with their disabilities? How do we pray with appropriate expectations? And how do we pray in ways so that people don't experience guilt for not experiencing certain kinds of or certain expectations regarding healing as traditionally communicated? In other words, we've got to find ways to talk and pray theologically about healing so that when a person leaves our congregation or when we're done with the practice of healing prayer, people aren't feeling like they're second-class citizens because God didn't touch them in traditionally expected ways, right? So that the end result is that we do continue to experience some forms of traditional healing, if not many forms of traditional healing, but we also can experience more people with disabilities in our churches because they're no longer feeling like they're marginal, or they're not chosen of God, or they're not excluded from God's grace and God's touch because they didn't come out of their wheelchair, or they didn't have to put away their cane. We've got to find ways to think about healing practices that don't decrease our motivation to pray for healing, but we've got to find ways to talk about and pray about healing in much more expansive terms.